Welcome, this is David. Today, we're going to be looking at why Orthodox Christians reject imagination in prayer and uh, more so looking contrasting our doctrine on prayer from the Roman Catholic perspective and also what saints have to say about this topic. Now, a lot of this is kind of a discussion that occurs many times in Orthodox communities, sometimes also Roman Catholic communities, on imagination, right? What we should think about it. And generally, from the Orthodox side, you see a very blanket condemnation of you're not supposed to imagine things during prayer, that's not good. It opens up to prelest, and I definitely agree with those arguments. But this video is not going to be looking at those arguments. Because first of all, I already agree with those arguments, but the more important reason is that they don't explain the why. They don't explain the theological framework that we have that leads to the conclusion we get to compared to the Roman Catholic or other world religions' theological framework and why they come to that conclusion. This is what this video is going to be about. We're going to be looking at the theological framework and why we don't take this stance. So, in order to kind of understand imagination in prayer, we kind of have to not imagine. So we have to talk about the powers that the soul has because it is a uh, relevant issue to talk about in relation to this topic. Saint Maximus the Confessor says, and I use this quote in the video on whether animals go to heaven or not. He says, lower creatures such as plants have life and their souls have the power of nourishment and growth. Then he says that the souls of animals also have the power of imagination and instinct. This is very critical. Imagination is an irrational function of the soul, whereas the souls of men have all these powers as well as the powers of intelligence and thought. So, as St. John Damascus later on confirms in the Fount of Knowledge, he says the imagination is the faculty belonging to the irrational part of the soul. It acts through the sense organs and is called a sensation. Moreover, that which comes within the province of the imagination and the senses is the imaginative and the sensible, just as the visible, say a stone or something of the sort, comes with the province of sight, which is the power of vision. An imagination or fantasy is an affection of the irrational part of the soul, arising from some imaginable object, but it is in reality just an illusion. It doesn't really exist. It is an empty affection arising in the rational parts of the soul from no imaginable object at all. The organ of the imagination is the anterior ventricle of the brain, which is, by the way, it's not surprising that St. John Damascus knows about the kind of scientific aspects, categorization of the brain. And this is, by the way, true because the Byzantines were for their time very scientifically advanced. Although if you listen to atheists, science and religion, they don't mix together. Well, the Byzantine Empire is the proof that the opposite is the case. But that's a bit off topic. But what we can learn from here, to summarize, is that imagination is an irrational thing. It's an irrational part of the soul. It's not the rational part of the soul. Now, if we get to the Ignatian Contemplation, which is a Roman Catholic understanding, this is based on the text from Ignatius of Loyola, who's the founder of Jesuits. He's a Roman Catholic saint, and he has a lot of different portions of spirituality he talks about, but he has a very, very heavy emphasis on using imaginations. From IgnatianSpirituality.com, and others, you can see the textbook, I'll put them in the description below. It says Ignatian contemplation is suited especially for the Gospels. In the second week of the exercises, we accompany Jesus through his life by imagining scenes from the Gospel stories. Let the events of Jesus' life be present to you right now. Visualize the event as you were making a movie. So that is essentially what we're talking about when we speak of imagination in prayer. Pay attention to the details, sights, sounds, tastes, and smells. Right? St. John Damascus talks about this, right? He describes that this is imagination. This is what it is about. Lose yourself in the story. Don't worry if your imagination is running too wild. At some point, place yourself in the scene. So it's very clear that at the very least, in some circles of Roman Catholicism, this is how you're supposed to be praying. Now, what I want to, before I get to the theological framework, I want to present to you some of the fathers speaking against imaginative prayer. You can find even more quotations, both pre-schism and post-schism. This is a very kind of, especially even in the West, but especially in the East, there's a lot of fathers that warn against this. So Saint John Climacus, on the latter, says the beginning of prayer consists in chasing away invading thoughts. The mind is to be freed from all thoughts and images and focused on the words of prayer. Further in the chapter on prayer, St. John instructs not to accept any sensual images during prayer, lest the mind falls into insanity, and not to gaze upon even necessary and spiritual things. So St. John is completely against using imagination prayer, which is a direct contrast to what we just talked about. St. Ignatius Branchianov also warns us that we should be guarding ourselves from imagination, which he says, which can make you fancy that you see the Lord Jesus Christ, that you touch and embrace him. This is empty play of puffed up and proud self-opinion. This is deadly self-praise. So he's speaking of pride, right? This leads to pride, according to Saint Ignatius. And likewise from Saint Simeon, the new theologian, he describes imaginative prayer, that these people, he speaks of people using imagination in prayer, but then he says during this type of prayer, little by little, he starts to puff up in his heart, not understanding this himself. It seems to him that what he is doing is from God's grace given for his comfort, and he asks God to let him always be in this state. But this is a sign of great deception. Such a person, if he practices this type of prayer in seclusion, will hardly be able to stay sane. Saint Simeon literally says if you use imagination, you're going to be insane eventually. And I honestly agree with him, because I see a lot of people who engage in this, and they talk about their experiences. And yes, these people are literally insane. And if you're one of those people, genuinely, please stop. Listen to what Saint Simeon has to say. If you don't care about what Saint Simeon or what Saint Ignatius thinks, please listen to Saint John at least, because he's a pre-schism saint. But those are the fathers, right? They warn against this. But what is the Orthodox alternative, right? Okay, we get it. We're not supposed to imagine things. So are we supposed to just read the words in front of us, or just like say them and keep our mind blank? What are we supposed to do? And this is where the Orthodox doctrine on Epinoia, which in English it's commonly translated as contemplation, and many other things as well, but we're going to be looking at it right now. Dr. David Bradshaw, in his article on Essence and Energies, What Kind of a Distinction, he says, broadly speaking, epinoia includes the faculty, the act, and the resulting conception formed by the process of reflecting upon and analyzing the deliverances of sense perception. So it kind of seems like imagination, and he kind of makes that point as well. He says, since this process can include taking things perceived and recombining them so as to produce fiction, such as giants and goat stacks, some of its products are merely imaginary. So, right, so far, we're not diverging too much. This is one aspect of it, but for our purposes, he says, its deliverances also include different ways of conceptualizing or describing a given object. So it seems like it has some relation to reality. He mentions that the different names Christ applies to himself, such as door, vine, and light, are given in accordance with different epinoiae based upon his different activities, meaning energies, and relations to creatures. Terms used of God, such as unbegotten and incorruptible, are likewise formed by considering through epinoia different aspects of the divine life. So, although yes, there is an imaginative aspect, but there's also an aspect of it that is absolutely not imaginative. And this is what it refers to. The names applied to God, the energies that we can apply to God, or terms, right? Unbegotten, for example, incorruptible. These are thoughts, these are contemplations that we can think of in our mind, but they're not merely creations of our mind. Rather, it is something that our mind accesses, that our mind perceives, kind of like how our eye can perceive things. Right now, I can perceive a laptop in front of me, this PowerPoint slide that I'm presenting to you. I can see that with my eye. Just like that, your mind, your nous ultimately can perceive things, perceive conceptual, immaterial things. But just because they're conceptual does not mean they're merely illusions. Actually points out that these are real things that we're talking about. And this is a huge feature of St. Basil the Great's debate against Eunomius. Dr. David Bradshaw, I'm still quoting from him. He says, as the against Eunomius proceeds, the linkage between epinoia and activity, meaning energeia, becomes stronger. Basil sees Eunomius' refusal to consider anything at all about God by way of conceptualization as leading to the absurd conclusion that all attributes of God refer to the divine substance. So, in short, and especially if you read Hildebrand's book on Saint Basil the Great, which I'll also be putting in the description below, he talks about this as well. And a huge feature of the debate is that Eunomius, when we speak about God, rejects using epinoia in reference to God. They don't really describe him in any way, whereas St. Basil says not only do they describe him, but they also even have actual existence. So if you take it from a face value, St. Basil will seem to say that our thoughts have real existence. But that's not really what he's saying. Rather, that we can genuinely perceive real things about God with our mind in epinoia, right? In our conceptions. He observes that it is absurd to suppose that God's creative power, providence, and foreknowledge are his substance, summarizing the point by asking, is it not ridiculous to regard every activity of his as his substance? So this argument basically says, if you cannot use any name for God, because for Eunomius is an Arian, and for him, we can't know God by epinoia. We can't know God by contemplation. Well, then how can we even know God? He says that, well, we know God as much as he knows himself. So we know him in his essence, whereas St. Basil rejects that. He says that's completely ludicrous. We can't accept that. We know him by his energies and we can contemplate about him, right? Make use of epinoia. So this is why it's so important and how we can actually have knowledge of God. And I think in a future video I want to make a more detailed breakdown on this, but to continue what Dr. Bradshaw was saying, evidently, just as in the case of Christ, the different names formed by epinoia are based upon different activities and relations to creatures. As Basil adds later, we are led up from the activities of God, and so come in this way to an understanding of his goodness and wisdom. So, to repeat kind of what Eunomius believes, for Eunomius, you cannot use epinoia to talk about God at all. The only way you can talk about God and to know God is by his essence. And as St. Basil points out, if all of the names that are applied to God are not conceptual names, right? Conceptual meaning epinoia, and just then, what else will they refer to? Well, they will only be able to refer to the substance. But if all of the different names apply to the substance, well, either those names are really distinct, which will mean different substances, which is polytheism, or all of those different names will mean the same thing. But being creator and being provident, for example, they are not the same thing. And likewise, if being creator was part of this substance, then it will have to be eternal. Then God will have to eternally create, right? The originist problem that I have talked about, and before me, Jay Dyer has talked about, and others have referred to this problem, and as Saint Basil refers to here. But as the Hildebrand book points out, and what the fathers point out, is that when we use these names, these terms of applied to God, we're not referring to his essence. So there's none of this supposed orthodox version of beatific vision. We don't believe in that. So we don't have a perception of God's essence. No one has seen God and lived, right? No one has seen the divine essence and lived. That's what that scriptural passage is referring to. But what it's talking about is that the names that are applied to God, the epinoia, have real existence, and when we perceive of them in our soul's nous, we actually can properly perceive God. However, the nous, just like in a way our eyes, need to be refined, right? Because our nous is dirty with passion, with the passions, right? With the passions of sin and all of that, all of those things. and it needs to be cleansed. And so, in order to cleanse it, we need to practice asceticism, we need to practice virtue, so that we can properly see and come to know God, and come to, properly pray to God. And this is why this doctrine is very, very crucial for Orthodox Christians, and why using imagination is completely unacceptable, because we have this doctrine of the distinction between essence and energies. We can actually come to know God by his energies. As St. Basil the Great says in letter 234, we can properly perceive and see God. It's paradoxical. No one has seen God and lived, but at the same time, Moses in Exodus has seen God. How is that even possible? Because we cannot see his essence, but we can see his energies. And the way we can perceive those things is through our mind, right? Or intellect. So, for example, the Epinoia, when applied to God, refers to concepts that have real existence. For example, logic is a concept, but we can see logic, right? We can't see it like as again, you can't see it like you can see your neighbor next door, but you can perceive it. And when you, quote, see it in a way, you understand what you're looking at. You're not visibly looking at something, but you are, in your mind's eye, in your nous, you are seeing something there. You might not be properly seeing it in full detail. And in order to be able to do that, right, you need to practice asceticism and Christian virtue to be able to properly see these things way better than you're seeing now. But you can still, in a way, see it. You still know what you're talking about. The same thing applies to God's energies, which will be love. This will be foreknowledge, incorruptibility, right? You can perceive and you know what these things mean. And what you're perceiving in your mind is something real. That doesn't mean that suddenly your mind has possession of God's incorruptibility, rather that you have knowledge of that, right? So we have knowledge of God this way, and in our prayer life, we contemplate about him this way, right? We don't try to, focus on seeing that or whatever. You don't try to use psionic energy nonsense. It's not like that, right? It is a common. Don't think of it like that, because a lot of what I'm saying is not going to be very fully understood, because a lot of this is a territory where words are not really that efficient. This is why it's important to kind of ask these spiritual questions to your priest and get advice from them, because we're getting to the territory where words are getting not as effective as we want them to be. But I hope you understand what I'm talking about here, because it is actually very, very crucial in our spiritual lifestyle. And this is what has been defended by St. Gregory Palamas. This is what hesychasm is all about. And it's not just a 14th century invention, but when St. Basil is arguing against Eunomius on Epinoia, he's defending hesychasm, right? He doesn't have to use that term or whatever, but in concept, this is what he is defending. So he's defending the legacy of the spiritual lifestyle of the church fathers after him and even before him, right? Like St. Anthony the Great. We not only do we have knowledge of God this way, when we contemplate about him, we can come to know him rather than imagine what we claim to know about him. So our epinoia are not merely mental constructs, as I said for the 15,000th time. They're not merely mental constructs that don't exist in reality, but they do exist in reality. And this has a very huge theological conclusion. I couldn't find the correct word, but conceptual distinction, right? Distinction kate epinoia. This is a theological term that is regularly used in reference to a lot of things. So, for example, the Council of Chalcedon, when it distinguishes the two natures of Christ, it conceptually distinguishes the two natures of Christ that way. And if you've seen the horrific debate that ended, horrific for him more so because he made himself look like a clown, just shuffling through papers, not knowing what he's talking about. But if you listen to Severin Zealot, when he speaks of conceptual distinction, he thinks of it in the Thomistic sense. He thinks of it as, oh, it's just an imagination, it's an illusion. But epinoia are not merely imagination, right? It's not merely imagination. It does refer to something real. And so The fact that Christ's two natures are distinguished conceptually actually proves that the two natures exist, right? This is the argument Leontius of Jerusalem uses against monophysites, that it actually proves, because how else will you perceive the two natures? Not by sense experience. How can you see the invisible divine nature, right? You can't see that. So the only way you can come to even know about the divine nature, right? The Epinoia, that's the only way you can come to know. Not imagination. You don't have to make up a caricature in your head, but through Epinoia, through your mind, your intellect, you can come to know it. And when I say know it, I mean knowledge, proper knowledge. The same applies to God's essence and his energies, right? The distinction. Dr. Bradshaw talks about this as well in his paper. And even the divine persons in the Trinity, right? We distinguish them conceptually. And as I said before, this is essentially what hesychasm really is all about. So I'm not claiming that this is all that hesychasm is, but a huge portion of what hesychasm is about this. St. Gregory Palamas makes this very clear in his debates. And this is why he kind of goes over this and changes distinction, because this is what it hinges on. This is why it's so important. We can truly contemplate and we can truly see God, like Moses and the apostles did. We don't have to know him by his essence, like Eunomius blasphemously taught, but we can contemplate his names, his relation to us, and his energies. Again, as St. Basil the Great says in letter 234. And this is why we don't use imagination, because imagination does not really allow us to come to know God. What allows us to come to know God is contemplating his energies, his powers. And this is how we have knowledge of him. This is not merely an intellectual academic tier of knowledge, but it encompasses spiritual life, right? It's spiritual life is a very, very important part of it. St. Gregory the Theologian regularly talks about this, how philosophy, love of wisdom, love of knowledge, is about living that way, not only conceptualizing things, but actually living that way, so that we can acquire virtues that is inherent in our human nature, but it's God's divine grace which is inherent in our human nature, and that we can see things more clearly by getting rid of the passions that burden us, right? These sins that burden us, so that we can be cleansed by them and come to know God more and more and more. All of these things that I'm talking about and more is part of the Orthodox lifestyle. So this is precisely why so many times I say that this kind of intellectual stuff and the mystical stuff, you cannot separate these things. You cannot pick and choose what you want and be a uniate or be a syncretist, or even who are those people who believe all religions are true. They're so insignificant. I don't even know what their name is, but some stupid name. We can't be any of these things. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. Because your scholastic understanding of theology and your mystical understanding of theology, they're united things. You can't separate these things and pick and choose what you feel like makes more sense and what you want more. Okay? So in short, it is the epinoia that allows us to properly come to know God, that in a way you make use of in prayer, but as I said, don't think of it as you're using psionic energy or whatever, that kind of stuff. As I said, a lot of this, the more detailed explanation, words cannot properly explain a lot of these things, but we reject imagination in prayer because we cannot come to know God. It creates illusions. It opens us up to demonic temptations, delusions, and pre-list, and that we can actually properly really come to know God by contemplation. And I hope I made my case here in this video. I had to repeat a lot of things over and over and over again, because I hope people understand what I'm trying to say here. And that's all I want to say for this video. Thank you all for watching this. If this kind of stuff interests you as an Orthodox Christian, definitely ask if you want to, and if your priest wants to talk about this. As I said, don't talk about this kind of stuff with random people online, because we're not your spiritual daddies, okay? Your spiritual father, or at least your priest, is supposed to be guiding you on these things. So if it interests you, you can ask your priest about this, or maybe visit a monastery and ask about this kind of stuff, right? The monks will definitely know about this. And if you're not an Orthodox Christian and you're part of a different religion who, doesn't have this kind of doctrine, then I hope it has at the very least piqued your interest. And I hope you become Orthodox and become a brother or sister in Christ. Thank you for watching this. I will see you guys in another video. God be with you all. Thanks for watching.